Great to be back. It's also great to be following such an illustrious trio of speakers. I don't have any of the same slides as any of the other speakers, but I'm certainly going to be touching on a number of the points that all of them made. And I'm going to try to tie everything together in the context of aging and, if you like, demystify the phenomenon of aging for you. I'm going to explain how well we understand aging at this point and how well we can actually describe what we might be able to do about it. I'm going to start with a paradox that a lot of people kind of sweep under the carpet, but which is a really good place to start in thinking about aging, which is this: the fact that we have been far, far less successful so far in postponing and combating the diseases and disabilities of old age than we have with regard to infectious diseases that we more or less figured out how to eliminate most of quite some time ago. Why is that? What is the reason for that? Most people, I think, would give this kind of answer. They would say, well, the problem is aging is rather complicated. You're not supposed to be able to read this slide, by the way, don't worry. An awful lot of things go wrong, and they go wrong all at the same time, more or less, and they exacerbate each other, and the whole thing is just too much of a Gordian knot. We're not going to be able to do much about that. But I believe that even though that is part of the answer, it's only the second most important part. This is where we should start. We should start by understanding what aging is simply in terms of a definition of it. And this is a perfectly good definition. And you will notice that this definition could equally be used for inanimate objects like cars or airplanes or whatever. It is a fact of physics, never mind biology, that any machine with moving parts is going to do damage to itself as an intrinsic, inevitable side effect of its normal operation. It's just going to happen. So if we define damage in this way, changes in the structure and composition of the body that cannot automatically be reversed and repaired as they happen by the built-in self-repair machinery that we have, that damage will accumulate throughout life, and eventually there will be more of it than what we are set up to tolerate. So you can think of that as a three-word definition of aging. Metabolism, the network of processes that keeps us alive, throughout life causes damage, which accumulates and eventually is intolerably abundant. That's all. So what does that actually mean in terms of the classification of ill health? This is what most people would say if you ask them the question, well, what types of ill health are there? They would say, well, there's infections, communicable diseases, and there's congenital diseases that a few people are unlucky enough to be born with. And then there's the chronic, age-related phenomena such as Alzheimer's and cancer and atherosclerosis and so on, which we're talking about today. And then completely separate from that, most people will tell you, in a completely different universe, there is this kind of nebulous, non-specific set of things called aging, which is not really disease. It's things like sarcopenia, the loss of muscle mass, for example. And because people think of this big black line here as separating diseases from aging, they kind of don't like to think of aging as even inherently, in principle, amenable to medical intervention. So that's a problem, because the real biologically correct way to think about this classification is like this. All the columns are the same, but the big black line is here. Really, there is no difference between column 3 and column 4 other than a semantic difference. The only difference is that column 3 consists of the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to, perhaps because it's fairly easy to say whether someone has them or doesn't have them. And the ones in column 4 we just don't call diseases. But that's purely semantic. All of these things are aspects of aging. They are side effects of being alive in the first place. They are the late life consequences of having too much of the damage that the body does to itself in the course of its normal operation. Now, the fact that we ignore that biological fact is tragic, because it results in this. It results in the overwhelming majority, in fact virtually all, of our medical expenditure and indeed our medical research with regard to the ill health of old age being focused down here on geriatric medicine, on essentially pretending that the diseases and disabilities of old age are, in principle, amenable to the same kind of medicine that we are so successful in using against infections. In other words, bashing away at the actual symptoms, at the pathologies, and trying to eliminate them from the body. It's obviously not going to work if you look at the definition of aging. You're not going to be able to eliminate a side effect of being alive in the first place without eliminating being alive in the first place, which would kind of defeat the object. So let's not do that. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out. For maybe a century, there have been a few people out there pointing out that actually it's not going to work, and therefore we have to intervene at an earlier stage in the chain of events and adopt the mantra of prevention being better than cure. That's where the field of gerontology really came from. The idea that maybe we could exploit the natural variation that we see in the living world with regard to the rate of aging, the rate of accumulation of damage, either between species or even within a species, and somehow, once we understood that well enough, apply it in a medical context so as to slow down the rate at which the body creates damage in the first place. That would be great. It would obviously postpone the age at which the damage becomes life-threatening. And it's kind of a good start, but it's got a couple of problems too. First of all, the later you start such an intervention, the less benefit you're going to get from it, because you've already got all that damage that the body already created. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, you've got this problem. Metabolism, just like aging, is really rather complicated. This is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body actually works. And as you can see, it's a little hairy. And it's really pretty much inconceivable that we would ever be able to manipulate, to tweak this network so that it didn't do the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, but still did do all the things we do need it to do. It's just not going to happen. Of course, that's an understatement of the problem. The real problem is that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which is completely dwarfed, as you all know, by the astronomical amount that we don't yet know, even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So, not going to happen. Not going to happen. Now, of course, some people might say, hang on, that sounds good in principle, and indeed, up until, let's say, the mid-1980s, pretty much all gerontologists had bought that argument and had pretty much given up on intervention. But of course, 20, 25 years ago, some discoveries were made to the effect that you could actually rather simply increase the longevity of certain model organisms by tweaking just individual genes. And actually, this shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as it was, because 50 years before that, in the 1930s, it was discovered that if you just feed a mouse or a rat, for example, less than it would like, then it also lives longer. Again, a very simple intervention, which seems mysteriously to have precisely this bizarrely implausible, coordinated impact on the rate at which damage is created. Thing is, though, it seems to be a bit of a false dawn. Have I got this? Yes, I do. Not only do we have the problem I already mentioned about damage that already happened not being removed, but also the reason this actually works, the reason we can do this in model organisms, is because they have genetic pathways already built into them that mediate this effect, that activate the slowing down of damage creation in consequence of this simple intervention, whether it be environmental or genetic or even pharmacological. And it turns out, unfortunately, that this bottom thing seems to be true. Both from evolutionary theory and from actual plenty of data that we have now, it's very clear that longer-lived species do not have such a strong effect. They're master control genes that get this thing going, that cause the elimination of adequate nutrition, for example, to have any effect, is still there. That's very conserved. But the magnitude of the effect is smaller in longer-lived species. And it seems to be almost infinitesimal, even in monkeys. And so I can't really see any great cause for optimism there. Though I wish I were wrong. It would be wonderful if this were true, and I'm very pleased that some people are still looking very hard at this. The question then is, do we have any alternative? And here I want to go back briefly to the fact that aging is just the same for the human body or for any living organism as it is for inanimate objects. It is the accumulation of damage that occurs as side effects of the body's normal operation. How did this car get this way? This is a 100-year-old car, and it was not designed to last maybe more than 10 years or 15 at the most. How come it's done so well? Answer, of course, is periodic, comprehensive preventative maintenance. That's what we do to keep cars or airplanes or whatever going. And that can be applied equally to living organisms such as you and me. The maintenance approach consists of going in here. Rather than trying to slow down the creation of damage or combat the translation of damage into pathology, instead, we separate those two processes from each other by diving in here and periodically removing most of the damage, some of the damage anyway, so that even though it's still being created, it does not reach this pathogenic threshold. And I claim, and I have been claiming for quite some years now, that this approach is vastly more promising than either of the other approaches. Now, that's a very strong statement, so I'm going to try and back it up. This is where the rubber hits the road, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this slide, not just because it's complicated, but because it leads me back to a number of the points that have been made by the previous speakers in this session. In order to adopt a comprehensive maintenance approach, you have to understand pretty well what damage is that you are trying to repair. If you only repair half of the different types of damage that are accumulating throughout life, you won't see much of an effect. You know, divide and conquer technological strategies of any kind, that's how they are. If you take a car and you take it apart and you put all the bits in a line and you pour burning petrol over each one, then none of them will exhibit any kind of motion. Okay, you have to actually put the car together and put the petrol in the right place. It's exactly the same here. We have to fix all of these things. Now, we've heard a lot already about stem cell therapy, which is, of course, the way to fix the loss of regenerative cells. And there is no question that stem cell therapy is an essential and absolutely huge component of what we need to do in order to implement a maintenance approach on the human body for the purpose of combating aging. But it's not going to do the whole job, because there are lots of things that also go wrong in the body that are going to carry on accumulating however robust our stem cells are, and are, I believe, going to prevent stem cell therapies on their own from really delivering what we would like in terms of the postponement of ill health in old age. We can see this in experiments where we transplant young stem cells into old animals, or vice versa. Even though there is often some effect, nevertheless, young stem cells don't work nearly so well in older animals as they do in young animals. And old stem cells work far better in young animals than they did in the old animal they came from. So we need to acknowledge that the environment, not just the immediate environment, but the systemic environment in which stem cells work, has an enormous impact on their prowess, their efficacy. This is an idea that I put forward more than a decade ago, and it's getting to stand the test of time. This 7-point plan, this little divide and conquer strategy that I've described here, I've been challenging people to find an 8th category for more than a decade now, and I seem to be getting away with it. Furthermore, rather hearteningly, I don't think I have a slide for it, but last year, a group of very eminent gerontologists produced a paper, which some of you may have seen, called The Hallmarks of Aging, in which they basically reinvented this concept. It was slightly irritating that they thought they presented it as new, and it was even more irritating that they didn't do it very well. They just completely forgot the bottom one. But still, the point is, this is an idea whose time has now finally come. This is an idea that really has gained a good deal of recognition. A number of more enlightened people in the biology of aging and regenerative medicine cottoned on to it a little bit sooner. That's why they joined our research advisory board. You can see some people you might recognize here. There's Daniel, here's Mike West, who ran Geron, here's William Hazeltine, who invented the term regenerative medicine, and so on. All of these people are, of course, extremely eminent, so that's very nice. But what, of course, really matters is, are we actually making concrete, practical progress towards the implementation of all of this? And one reason why I feel that we really are in the exponential phase now, the phase where we can see progress and indeed see the acceleration of progress, is because of the work that is actually coming out now, not only in the stem cell area, but in other areas too. SENS Research Foundation is quite small. We're a 501c3 based up in Mountain View, and our budget is only about $5 million a year. And for that reason, we hardly do any stem cell work, simply because there are wonderful organizations such as Human Longevity doing the work that we think needs to be done. There's only a few exceptions that we think we need to do instead. But many of the other categories that I mentioned earlier, the same cannot be said for. And that's why we exist. That's why SENS Research Foundation exists. These are the kinds of things that we're doing. I'm just putting a few up there that we've published recently or are about to publish. These are major components of regenerative medicine for aging that I believe are just as important as the things that you've been hearing about earlier on. I'm going to talk about a couple of them because they lead back into Alan's talk about inflammation. This is one of the most important and prevalent examples of inflammation in old age, atherosclerosis. It begins not as inflammation, but rather as simply the elimination of detritus. In the major arteries, stuff gets stuck. And white blood cells, a particular type of white blood cell called a macrophage, goes into the artery wall and reprocesses this detritus and recycles it for reuse. And that's wonderful. Unfortunately, there are some contaminants in that detritus which the macrophage does not know how to handle. In particular, there are certain types of oxidized cholesterol that essentially poison the macrophage and turn it into this thing, a foam cell. This used to be a perfectly self-respecting white blood cell, but it ain't anymore. As you can see, it's full of lipid globules, and it's not doing its job anymore. And that is where the inflammation of atherosclerosis begins. Even young kids have a few of these in their major arteries, but as life goes on and you accumulate more of them, the cells around them start getting angry. The vascular smooth muscle cells in particular start to release pro-inflammatory signals. More white blood cells come in an attempt to eliminate this substance, but here's the problem. It's good that we have an inflammatory response. If we didn't have one, then we wouldn't be nearly so effective at fighting off infections. But the inflammatory response has been built under the evolutionary expectation that the cause of the inflammation can be eliminated from the body. And in this case, it can't. So every white blood cell that comes in here simply becomes part of the problem. And they continue to accumulate, and eventually we get atherosclerotic plaques. The only way we can fix this is not just by dampening down the immune system, because this is still going to carry on happening, and also we don't want to dampen it down too much, but by actually getting rid of the source of the inflammatory response. And that's what we're doing. The particular oxidized cholesterol derivative called 7-ketocholesterol is known to be public enemy number one in this space. It's the most abundant and the most toxic. And what we have found is that we can identify bacteria which can break down this stuff. We can identify the genes and enzymes that are allowing them to do so. We published those results several years ago now. And just more recently, we've been able to actually modify that gene and those enzymes so that they can be expressed in human cells and targeted to the correct place, and sure enough, they protect those cells from this toxic molecule. So here we're basically showing that if you have huge amounts of 7-ketocholesterol, then all the cells die, whatever. But for more modest concentrations, the right-hand bar is highest. That means that cells that have been appropriately modified are doing much better than the negative controls, which don't have the enzyme, or they've got the wrong enzyme, or the enzyme isn't targeted to the right part of the cell. So that's handy. That's a waste product that the body accumulates, and we have to get rid of these things in order to truly comprehensively apply regenerative medicine to aging. We have waste products outside the cell as well. One of the most high-profile aspects of aging, especially in extreme old age, people over the age of 100, 105 these days, is something called systemic amyloidosis, especially systemic cardiac amyloidosis, the weakening of the heart by the accumulation of a substance rather like senile plaques in Alzheimer's disease, but made of a different stuff, which basically just gets in the way and stops the mechanical function of the heart from working so well. It happens when this very important protein, transthyretin, is unable to take up its proper physiological form, which is a tetramer, but instead it adopts a misfolded monomeric form, which aggregates into fibrils. And the group that we're funding in Texas has been able to identify antibodies that can not simply bind specifically to the misfolded form, but can actually chop it up, can break it down proteolytically. So that was, as you see, published just this year. We're very happy about that, and again, we hope to be able to take that through to clinical trials very soon. There's a lot more to this, obviously. I wrote this book some years ago, which I recommend to you all, of course. I also recommend the workshop after lunch that I will be conducting together with my awesome colleague, Maria Entragues, in which we will cover whatever you like, plenty more of this, but also the wider social context and motivation for why we work on this, why we believe that it is unequivocally humanity's worst problem, and that we are in range of turning out a solution at an exponentially accelerating rate. Thank you very much.